This section will go over regulatory exclusivity. In addition to the protections derived from patents, the Food and Drug Administration and other regulators in other countries may grant market exclusivity to drugs meeting specific conditions. The reason why these government agencies grant exclusivity is to foster innovation and to promote the development of drugs for applications that might otherwise offer insufficient motivation. This table highlights some of the differences between patents and regulatory exclusivity. Patents, as I mentioned in the last lecture, are issued by patent offices. Regulatory exclusivity, by contrast, is issued by drug regulatory agencies. Patents are property rights. In this case, intellectual property, but still, it follows the same law as other property rights such as real estate or other physical belongings. Regulatory exclusivity, on the other hand, is not a property right, but simply prevents the approval of competing drugs. The enforcement of patents is based on the claims, and the claims of the patent describe the invention and what makes it novel, not obvious, and useful. For regulatory exclusivity, on the other hand, enforcement is based on the regulatory criteria. Patents may be invalidated if it's found that patents were filed incorrectly, or simply if evidence arises showing that a patent was not novel, such as prior publication. On the other hand, regulatory exclusivity generally cannot be invalidated. Some other differences are that patents must generally be filed before clinical trials. As for regulatory exclusivity, it's generally granted after approval of a drug. Patents can be asserted against marketed drugs, but also against drugs which are in development. Regulatory exclusivity, on the other hand, can generally only be used to prevent approval of competing drugs. The duration of patents tends to be tied to the patent filing date, whereas for regulatory exclusivity, the duration of the exclusivity is tied to either the drug approval date or the patent expiration date. So this chart illustrates the timeline which I described earlier on. The black bar across the top is simply a timeline from preclinical research to the start of clinical trials to drug approval, all the way to exclusivity and patents when generics can enter. The orange bars below show regulatory exclusivity, and there's various lengths, and there's some bars which extend the end of patents. I'll be going over those in more detail before I come back to this slide again. And the blue bars at the very bottom show the patents. The reason why it's split is because there may be extensions applied onto patents. Don't worry about getting into too much detail in this figure right now. I'll be going over the types of regulatory exclusivity and then coming back to this chart. So some of the most common kinds of regulatory exclusivity are new chemical exclusivity, which lasts 5 years from the date of approval and is given, as described, to new chemicals which have never before been approved as a drug. In the case of new chemical exclusivity, it also defines the earliest date that patent challenges can occur, because the FDA will not even review a generic application until 1 year before the exclusivity date expires, and you'll see this term used in the press sometimes as the NCE-1 date. Another type of exclusivity is new clinical investigation exclusivity. This lasts 3 years from the date of approval, and this is granted to drugs for which there's new clinical trials involved in finding, for example, new indications or testing new formulations of drugs, for example. I mentioned that some exclusivities also extend patents, and one of them is pediatric clinical trials exclusivity. If the FDA requests a drug company to conduct clinical trials on pediatric populations, and they do conduct those trials, regardless of the outcomes of those trials, regardless of whether or not a drug is actually approved for pediatric use, the drug still gets a 6-month extension of its patent life. Exclusivity effectively extends the patent. And this is always something to watch out for when tracking generic launch dates, because if pediatric clinical trials haven't yet been asked for and haven't yet been conducted, it's possible that the patent will be extended and generic entry will have to wait 6 months longer than anticipated. Another type of exclusivity is orphan drug exclusivity, and this applies in the United States to drugs which affect less than 200,000 Americans. There's other versions in other countries around the world, and in the States, orphan drug exclusivity offers 7 years of exclusivity from the date of approval, and in some cases, this may actually last longer than the anticipated patent protection duration. And finally, another common form of exclusivity comes from the GAIN Act, Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now, which offers a 5-year extension of exclusivity and encourages the development of new antibiotics. Continuing, two other forms of exclusivity are patent challenge exclusivity, and this one's different in that it doesn't protect branded or novel drugs, but rather offers 6 months of generic exclusivity for the first generic company to successfully challenge an innovative drug's patents. This can be rather lucrative because it gives one generic firm the opportunity to build relationships with the supply chain partners and pharmacies and wholesalers and what have you before everyone else can launch. The competitive generic therapy similarly offers benefits for generic drugs, and it offers expedited approval and 180 days of marketing exclusivity. For biologic drugs, the situation is a little bit different. The FDA will not receive a biosimilar application until 4 years after the original biologic license application date, the date after the first biologic was approved. Further, the FDA cannot approve a biosimilar until 12 years after the original biologics license application. As for small molecules, biologics are also eligible for 6 months pediatric exclusivity and the 7-year orphan drug exclusivity. There's also benefits for biosimilar entrants, as the first company to successfully develop an interchangeable biosimilar can obtain up to 1 year of market exclusivity from other biosimilars. So as you can see, regulatory exclusivity for both small molecules and for biologics offers incentives both for innovators and for later followers, such as generics and biosimilars. So return to the timeline I showed earlier. You see, for example, the orange bars starting from the drug approval date can offer 3 and 5 years or 7 years of marketing exclusivity. The patent may or may not have extensions applied to it, and pediatric exclusivity extensions can apply to the end of the patent life, making it last just a little bit longer.
Ask me anything. Here's my email address, yali@drugpatentwatch.com. I look forward to your questions and comments.